Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. This Saturday is UFC 278, and in the co-main event, we have Paulo Costa versus Luke Rockhold, and I've already done a full breakdown and prediction for this fight, so if you want to know who I think wins on Saturday night, I will link that down in the description. But all this week, Luke Rockhold, in his media scrums, has been highly critical of the UFC, and I wanted to discuss some of these topics because I believe there's not enough coverage on issues like the fight night bonuses, the fighter pay issues, the crypto bonuses, the sponsorships, especially by mainstream MMA media. And there's one main reason they do not cover it or don't cover it nearly enough, and we'll talk about that later in the video. But I also believe there is a set of fans who will just blindly defend the UFC no matter what. And I understand they love the sport, and a lot of these people consider UFC, the organization themselves, they consider it the sport, and they want to be defensive of it. But there's some things that go on behind closed doors and stuff that we have information on that is just not nearly discussed enough. And everything that Luke Rockhold was critical of this week was 100% accurate. Now, there's also a couple other topics I'm going to throw in here because they're kind of related to the issue, but Luke Rockhold didn't specifically talk about these issues. But I'm also going to talk about the issues he brought up, the $50K fight night bonuses, the fighters' health insurance, and I'm also going to talk about his criticisms of Full Send MMA, which, I mean, a lot of people are talking about that. He also talked about Barstool Sports and some of these MMA media entities that have relationships with Dana White, so they get extra access, and it's not the greatest of MMA media at all. We'll talk about that as well. But first off, let's start with the $50K fight night bonuses, because this is a big topic that Luke Rockhold brought up. And the UFC has been giving out $50K bonuses for a very long time. And Luke's been saying, what is going on here? These bonuses have been given out for a long time. And I know there's a lot of people who are going to say, well, they're bonuses. What do you care? They're just bonuses. There's a lot of fighters that go out there and rely on these bonuses. They hope to get these bonuses to help supplement their income because maybe they're only getting paid $12K to show up and $12K to win. So they're hoping and praying they can get $50K on top of it just because they don't make enough money as it is. For most people, don't even realize these fighters show up and they have a show fee and then a win fee. So they may only make $12K to show up, and if they lose, which, I mean, you can train your hardest. You can put everything into a training camp. You get clipped with one punch, you lose. Now you already lost 50% of your money, which is just a topic for another video. But some of these fighters are just in hopes. The UFC dangles this $50K bonus out there, and these fighters rely on that to help, boost their income. And I went back and did the math since 2010. The UFC has been giving out the $50K bonuses for a long time, but I went out since 2010. $50K in 2010 to 2022 has been a loss of 26.4%. $50K's worth in 2010 to compared to now in 2022, based on inflation, is only worth just under $37,000. So it's absolutely insane that the UFC has not raised these bonuses. It's insane. And Luke Rockholds mentioned that. How is that possible that the UFC has grown so much as a company, but they refuse to increase bonuses? Maybe $75K or even $100K. But $50K is now worth $37,000 or just under $37,000 in 2022, adjusted for inflation, losing 26% of its worth since 2010. That's absolute insanity. The UFC gives out these bonuses, and I understand that people are going to say, well, they're just bonuses. There is fighters who rely on this to make their living because they're making so little money from the UFC actually directly during their, from their contract itself. The other thing that Luke Rockhold brought up was fighter health insurance. These fighters are only covered by the UFC health insurance if they are injured during a fight. So if they're training for a fight, let's say, they're training for a fight 2 months out, they got an 8-week training camp, 4 weeks into their training camp, they tear their ACL. The UFC is not required to pay for them to get that surgery. And when they're working for the UFC, they may not have another form of insurance. So these fighters are getting screwed out of, they're being injured. They could break a limb. They could get a serious injury that they can never recover from. and they have no type of insurance. And not only is this terrible for the fighter, this is terrible for us fans too, because fighters who may have serious injuries will go into fights seriously injured only so they can get the UFC to cover their potential surgery or whatever procedure they may need. So they may tear their ACL, but they may go forward with the fight, not say anything about it, so then they can claim that they tore it in the fight, so then the UFC has to cover it, because otherwise they may not be able to afford it, or they may go bankrupt trying to pay for these surgeries. So then we get fighters who aren't at 100% competing, and I get no fighters ever at an actual 100%, as far as health. But we have guys going in there injured just because they can't afford their health insurance. That is one of the most egregious things I've ever heard of. And I don't know exactly what the answer is for this. But the UFC, with all the money they're making from sponsors, from live gates, from pay-per-view sales, from the ESPN deal, from all these different income sources, the UFC should be able to put a fund together. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm not saying it should be lifetime health insurance, but there should be a way to cover these guys long term. Like if you fight, 5-6 times in the UFC, you should at least be covered for your fight camps and maybe a couple years after you leave the UFC. There has to be some way to support these fighters, especially when it comes to these serious injuries. Because think of guys like Chris Weidman. He broke his leg. He may deal with issues from that broken leg from 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There might still be serious issues in relation to that broken leg. Another thing I want to talk about is the UFC uniform deal with Venom and their sponsorship, the whole sponsorship thing. And what happened is the UFC used to pay these fighters not that much money, but the fighters were able to go out there and get sponsorships from other companies to then put on their shorts, to put on their banner behind them, which they used to have banners behind them. They don't have them anymore. And they were able to supplement their income by being able to get those sponsors. Well, the UFC said, you know what? We want to clean up the sport. We're going to sign the Reebok deal. We're going to then transfer to the Venom deal. And we're not going to have all these sponsors plastered all over the place. And now the UFC is going out there and selling ad space on the apparel that the UFC fighters are then having to wear when they go fight. During fight week, they're told they can only wear certain brands. And I get it. It's the UFC's air. They're putting it on TV. They want to decide what they show. But then if they're going to take away these sponsorships from these fighters, why not increase the pay of the fighters? And they say, oh, well, they're getting a cut from it. It's close to nothing. It's nowhere close to what they were getting from actual sponsorship deals. And what really grinds my gears about this is they said they wanted to clean up the look. And they talked, oh, we don't want, all these ads plastered all over these shorts and this and that. And then they go right out and they do the exact same thing, but they're collecting the majority of the money from it. And UFC says they want to clean up the sport. Look at all the ads plastered all over the octagon floor. It is hideous to look at. They're talking about cleaning up the sport. They signed this crypto.com bonus, which we're also going to talk about something else to do with that in a minute. But they have these big crypto things just right on the front of the shirts. It looks so dumb. And I can't believe people are actually buying these, because all it is a crypto.com ad. I mean, and the UFC says, oh, we're just trying to clean up the sport and make it look good. Do you see any NFL players, playing the game on Sunday and they got big ads plastered on the front of their jerseys? No. So the UFC used that as a lie so they could take away sponsors from the fighters, so then the UFC could just sell sponsorships to other companies that they deemed worthy and collect the majority of the revenue from that. And the other thing I have to say about the crypto.com thing, they do these now crypto bonuses where they let the fans vote. First place gets $30K in Bitcoin. Second place gets $20K. Third place gets $10K. And this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard of, because this is nothing more than a popularity contest. Just to show you how dumb this bonus structure is, Rose Namajunas got first place and got $30K in Bitcoin when she fought Carla Esparza in the rematch just recently. That was one of the worst fights I've ever seen. But she got that bonus because she was the more popular fighter. And historically, you look at all the crypto.com bonuses, they're only popular fighters on the card that are getting these bonuses. Not the fighters on the prelims who put on a crazy fight or get a crazy knockout. They don't get the money because none of these fans actually know who they are. So this is the dumbest, bonus structure I've ever seen in my entire life. And the fighters who deserve these bonuses aren't actually getting them. And then you have the UFC then giving out, these media credentials to Full Send MMA and Barstool Sports. And it's the worst MMA coverage I've ever seen. And you have the specific example about Full Send MMA, which is related to the Nelk boys. And the reason Dana White and the UFC does this is purely for promotion. The Nelk boys has the same demographic of audience that the UFC wants to attract, which is young men. So that Dana White and the UFC look at this as an advertising, a way to advertise the UFC to their fan base. And they want to use Nelk Boys fan base to then attract more people to buy their pay-per-views, buy their memorabilia, all that good stuff. So they credential these terrible reporters. And there's not a lot of great MMA reporters to begin with, but they have these terrible reporters. And in this specific instance, you have the Full Send MMA reporter, I don't even remember his name, cringy as hell, giving Chito Vera some luchador mask. And forget about whether it had to do with him confusing culture, calling Chito a Mexican, rather, he's from Ecuador. Forget about that. This is the cringiest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and it has no place in the sport. Would this fly in the NFL? No, it wouldn't. And you have media members who have been around forever, putting in work for 15, 20 years, covering UFC. And then all of a sudden, the UFC gives the credentials to these guys and gives them way more access than they give to reporters who have put in the work just to get cringy sound bites and cringy video interviews of giving Chito Vera a luchador mask. That is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And it is so cringy. And shout out to Luke Rockhold for criticizing this guy for it. Even if it wasn't the cultural mistake that he says it was, borderline, it has no business in the UFC. These fighters should not have to put up with these weird, cringy outlets who don't even know that much about the sport. They really don't. They don't do their homework, like Luke Rockhold said, and they come out there and they do these terrible interviews. They ask these cringy questions, and it just has no place in MMA media. And then on top of that, you have the mainstream MMA media who the reason they don't cover a lot of these topics when it comes to the sponsorships and the fighter pay and all that stuff, the crypto bonuses, and some do, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all of them don't. The reason they don't cover these topics is because the UFC credentials them to come to their events. And if they are too critical about the UFC, about Dana White, what Dana White and the UFC will do is just remove their credentials. So if you go out there and you're saying, you know what, the UFC is terrible, this and that, here's all the reasons why the UFC, is terrible, and talking about fighter pay and talking about sponsorships and talking about the uniform deal, then the UFC will just say, okay, you're not allowed to come to the events anymore, essentially ending some people's careers. They may cover the UFC, they may cover them for 10, 15 years, and now they're no longer at events. And that they aren't big enough where they can go and do something else, start, whatever website they want to start, because it's impossible. Their coverage is predicated on doing in-person coverage of the UFC. So now their whole entire career is ended because they were critical of the UFC. And the UFC has done this time and time again, where they have banned reporters who have asked legitimate questions. And it's just ridiculous that they do that. And then they have Full Send MMA and Barstool Sports asking the dumbest questions and fanboying over certain fighters and just having overall terrible coverage, all because they, are just predicated to a young male demographic, and the UFC is just saying, oh, well, I don't care if their coverage is terrible, as far as actual quality. We don't care because we're going to get into this demographic. So I really believe there's too little discussed about all these issues, and there's so much more we can go into, but I am so happy that Luke Rockhold went out of his way, because he knows right now, I believe he's 37 years old. If he loses to Paulo Costa, the UFC is probably going to part ways with him. If he beats Paulo Costa, he's probably only got two or three more fights left in him. That's the reality of Luke Rockhold. Right now, he's in a place where the criticism isn't going to ruin his career. If he goes out there and stops Paulo Costa, he's going to be in a good spot. And maybe the UFC doesn't give him a title shot because of how critical he's been. But I don't think he really cares about it. And Luke Rockhold can go out there and criticize the UFC, and I guarantee Dana White and the UFC do not like it at all. But he's in a position where he's not one of these guys who's 25 years old or 28 years old, and then the UFC is going to try to derail their entire career because of the criticism. Luke Rockhold can come out and criticize the UFC and get away with it because of where he's at in his career. And if he goes out there and let's say he gets chinned against Paulo Costa at UFC 278, which a lot of people are predicting, Dana White will be asked questions about it. He'll be like, well, he can go make money elsewhere. But the sad reality is the UFC has a monopoly on MMA. There's just no other organization that has the ability to promote fights and, just make the amount of money that the UFC can make just because of how long they've been around and how well they've done. And I'm not one of these people that's just crazy and saying the UFC needs to give 75% of their revenue to the fighters. But you look at some of these fight night cards. I remember UFC 270. The total payout to all the fighters was something like $2.2 million. Just from the live gate, the UFC made about $5.5 million. Just from the live gate. That doesn't include any of the advertising revenue that the UFC made or any of the pay-per-view sales from the ESPN deal that the UFC made. That's how insane the pay is in the UFC. Every fighter on a pay-per-view made about $2.2 million. And the UFC probably made somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 million, somewhere along those lines, without actually knowing the numbers, because the UFC doesn't always release the numbers. Because if they did, then people would be in a much better position to criticize the UFC based on the numbers. So let me know what you guys think about all this. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.